Did you know that nearly 158 million people worldwide are trapped in toxic relationships every single year? Psychologists estimate that about 1 in 20 adults is a narcissist, a perverse narcissic, a manipulator, someone who thrives on control, guilt, and psychological games. That means millions of people wake up each day questioning their reality, stuck in a toxic couple dynamic, or feeling suffocated inside a relationship that slowly destroys their confidence. And here's the part nobody tells you. Studies show that staying in a toxic relationship can actually shorten your life expectancy by up to 10 years, the same impact as smoking a pack of cigarettes every day. Imagine that love turned into poison, affection turned into addiction, intimacy turned into a silent prison. If you've ever felt trapped by a manipulator, if you've ever wondered why you can't break free from a toxic relationship or a narcissistic partner, what you're about to hear may change the way you see everything. And listen, if what I'm about to share resonates with you, even just a little, do me one favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, drop a simple thank you in the comments, or subscribe. It changes everything for what comes next. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Freud added that the greatest prison of the mind is the compulsion to repeat the same patterns without knowing why. And if you've ever found yourself drawn into the orbit of a narcissist, someone who drains your energy, twists your reality, and leaves you questioning your own worth, you've been trapped in exactly that unconscious cycle. Studies in psychology show that nearly 6% of the population meets the criteria for narcissistic personality disorder. That means millions of people walk among us carrying this mask of confidence and charm while hiding a deep hunger for control. But the real battlefield is not their charm, not their insults, not even their manipulations. It's your own psyche, the unseen places where they plant their hooks. Think about it. Have you ever noticed how a narcissist seems to know exactly where to strike? Epictetus taught that no man can harm you unless you give him permission through your own judgment. And yet, time and again, people feel crushed by narcissists because they unknowingly hand over that permission. Neuroscientists have studied this effect. In one experiment published by the National Institute of Mental Health, people who were subjected to repeated emotional invalidation showed heightened activity in the amygdala, the fear center of the brain. This means every dismissive comment, every cold look, every subtle insult isn't just a social interaction. It's training your brain to stay in a state of survival. And when you're in survival mode, you are easier to control. Mark Aurelius wrote in his Meditations that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. The narcissist understands this instinctively. They flood you with their colors, grandiose stories, shifting blame, impossible expectations, and before long, you begin to wear their shade. You question whether you are the problem. You replay conversations at night. You feel compelled to prove your worth to someone who never intended to see it. And this is not a coincidence. Research from Dr. Ramani Durvasula, one of the leading experts on narcissism today, shows that narcissists exploit what she calls the empathy gap. They target people with high sensitivity, deep empathy, or a strong desire for connection. They sense it like a shark senses blood in the water. Here's the paradox. You might believe you are powerless because of their intelligence, their charisma, or their dominance. But data shows that narcissists are not actually more intelligent or successful in the long term. In fact, studies from the University of Georgia reveal that narcissists often sabotage their own success through arrogance. So why do they still hold power over you? Because the battlefield isn't external. It's the invisible conversation inside your head. It's the self-doubt they amplify, the hope they manipulate, and the shame they cultivate. Jung described the shadow as the disowned parts of ourselves that others can easily exploit. The narcissist feeds on that shadow, holding up a mirror that distorts your reflection until you can no longer tell where you end and they begin. Let's pause here. How many times have you felt that mix of anger and helplessness after an interaction with a narcissist? One moment you're furious, ready to cut ties, and the next you're questioning if you overreacted. That tug of war is exactly the battlefield. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, warned that anger is a form of temporary madness. But he also gave a path forward, to observe it, to dissect it, and to see the illusion beneath it. In modern terms, neuroscientists call this cognitive reappraisal, the act of reframing an emotional experience to weaken its grip. The narcissist thrives when you don't reframe, when you accept their version of reality as your own. And here's what most people don't realize. The narcissist's greatest weapon is not their words, but your silence. When you stop questioning, when you stop analyzing, when you stop challenging, you begin to carry their truth as if it were yours. That's why they isolate you. That's why they twist facts. That's why they mix love with cruelty. Freud called this traumatic bonding, a cycle where intermittent reinforcement makes you addicted to the very person who hurts you. It's not weakness on your part, it's a predictable neurological loop. Dopamine when they show affection, cortisol when they withdraw. Your body learns to crave the highs and tolerate the lows, until you mistake chaos for intimacy. So the hidden battlefield is not out there, it's in here. In your mind, your nervous system, your unspoken fears. The narcissist wins because they fight on terrain you don't even know exists. But once you see it, once you name it, the ground shifts. You begin to realize that revenge doesn't start with hurting them. It begins with reclaiming yourself. And the first step is clarity. Understanding that every time you felt small in their presence, it wasn't because you lacked value. It was because they lacked the capacity to see it. The battlefield is hidden, yes, but it is also yours to win. Carl Jung warned us that the greatest danger is not what lies outside, but what lurks within the unexamined psyche. He spoke often of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or hide from others. Freud went further, describing how unresolved childhood wounds shape adult behaviors, making us susceptible to repeating destructive relationships. When you're entangled with a narcissist, you are not simply facing another person's toxicity. You're also confronting your own shadow. That is why their power feels magnetic. They mirror what you don't want to see in yourself. They awaken the old wounds you thought you buried, and they use that unconscious vulnerability to keep you in their orbit. Neuroscience confirms this ancient insight. Studies from Harvard show that when people encounter rejection or humiliation, the same regions of the brain light up as when they experience physical pain. In other words, a narcissist's cutting remark doesn't just sting, it leaves a neurological scar. Over time, repeated exposure changes the pathways of your brain, strengthening the circuits of fear, shame, and dependency. This is why even intelligent, strong, accomplished individuals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, entrepreneurs, can find themselves hooked by someone who seems, on the surface, unworthy of their time. It isn't logic, it's biology colliding with psychology. Take the story of Sylvia Plath, the brilliant poet. In her journals, she described relationships where she felt diminished, silenced, made to doubt her own brilliance. Though she never used the word narcissist, the patterns she described are strikingly similar to what psychologists today recognize as narcissistic abuse. Plath's genius was suffocated by those who fed on her sensitivity. Jung would say her anima, her inner creative spirit, was trapped in a shadow battle against forces she couldn't name. How many times have you felt the same? Brilliant ideas cut down with sarcasm, dreams dismissed as unrealistic, emotions mocked as weakness. That is the narcissist's trap. They turn your gifts into weapons against you. Epictetus, the Stoic slave turned philosopher, once said, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them." And yet, when dealing with a narcissist, your view is not entirely your own. They infiltrate it. They rewrite it. Psychologists call this gaslighting, a term first popularized from a 1944 film where a manipulative husband convinces his wife she is losing her mind. Modern studies show gaslighting causes a measurable erosion of confidence, even in highly resilient people. In one survey conducted across multiple clinics, over 70% of victims of long-term narcissistic abuse reported symptoms of complex PTSD, including hypervigilance and intrusive thoughts. This is not mere drama. This is trauma carved into the nervous system. But here is where Freud and Jung diverge in their lessons. Freud might tell you that the narcissist's grip comes from your unresolved childhood bond with a parent who withheld love or approval. He would argue that you are replaying that script, trying desperately to resolve it. Jung, however, would tell you that the narcissist is an archetype, a trickster, a shadow figure who arrives not to destroy you, but to force you to grow. In Jung's words, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The narcissist's trap, then, is also an invitation. A cruel one, yes, but also a chance to integrate your shadow and reclaim your wholeness. Let's bring in modern neuroscience again. When you confront your shadow, when you bring unconscious patterns into awareness, you literally change your brain. This is called neuroplasticity. By naming the trap, by seeing the pattern, you weaken the old neural circuits and strengthen new ones. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of The Body Keeps the Score, demonstrated how survivors of trauma can rewire their emotional responses through mindfulness, therapy, and self-awareness. What this means for you is simple but profound. The very act of realizing that you are in a narcissist's trap is the first strike of liberation. Awareness is not passive. It is an active rewiring of your nervous system. So when you ask, why can't I just walk away? Why do I feel stuck? The answer lies in both the shadow and the science. You are not weak. You are patterned. You are neurologically tied to the very person who wounds you. And the narcissist thrives because they know you will keep questioning yourself instead of questioning them. That is the essence of the trap. But every trap has an escape route. Freud gives you one. Trace the roots of your wound back to its origin and see the repetition for what it is. Jung gives you another. Face the shadow, integrate it, and transform pain into power. The Stoics give you yet another. Reclaim your perspective, master your inner judgment, and break the spell of external control. The moment you see the trap not as fate, but as a construct, you take the first step out of it. The shadows are real. The trap is powerful. But the moment you make it conscious, it loses its teeth. When you're caught in the orbit of a narcissist, it feels like you're constantly losing ground. One day you think you've gained clarity, the next you're tangled again in doubt. Carl Jung would call this a psychic possession, when an archetypal force takes over your perception and drives your behavior as if you were no longer yourself. Freud described something similar with the concept of transference, where we project old relationships onto new figures. The narcissist exploits both. They don't simply argue with you or criticize you. They manipulate the very lens through which you see the world. And once they distort your lens, they control your reality without you realizing it. Let's look at how this works. A study from the Journal of Personality Disorders found that narcissists consistently use 3 tactics to maintain control: gaslighting, intermittent reinforcement, and triangulation. Gaslighting makes you question your memory. Intermittent reinforcement keeps you hooked through cycles of affection and rejection, the same principle used in casinos to create addiction. Triangulation brings a third party, another friend, a family member, even a stranger, into the equation, subtly suggesting that everyone else sees things their way. Each tactic erodes your confidence while deepening their grip. Imagine this scenario. You confront them about a lie, and instead of acknowledging it, they twist the story until you're defending yourself. This isn't coincidence, it's strategy. Dr. George Simon, an expert in manipulative personalities, explains that narcissists operate through covert aggression, meaning their attacks are disguised as confusion, concern, or even love. They will say things like, "You're imagining things," or "I only said that because I care." Over time, you stop trusting your instincts. You start relying on them to define what is real. That's the illusion of control. You think you're making choices, but those choices are happening inside a reality they've carefully engineered. Seneca warned 2,000 years ago, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." The narcissist weaponizes this truth. They plant seeds of doubt, fear, and shame, and then they let your imagination do the rest. Neuroscience reveals why this is so effective. The human brain has what's called a negativity bias. We pay more attention to threats than to neutral or positive events. If a narcissist criticizes you once, that single remark can overshadow 10 compliments. Your mind keeps replaying the wound, trying to resolve it. And while you're replaying, they're rewriting the script. Think of Freud's patient Dora, one of the earliest documented cases of psychological manipulation. She was made to believe her perceptions were invalid, her protests over an affair dismissed as hysteria. Freud recognized that her sense of reality had been hijacked by those who stood to gain from her silence. Today, psychologists call this reality distortion, and it's one of the hallmarks of narcissistic abuse. It leaves you unsure not only of them, but of yourself. And once you doubt yourself, they win. But here's the paradox. The narcissist doesn't actually have control. They only create the illusion of control by exploiting your trust, your empathy, and your fear of abandonment. Once you remove those levers, their power collapses. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Awakening means seeing the mechanics of their manipulation for what it is, a performance, not a truth. Consider the neuroscience of choice. Researchers at Columbia University discovered that when people feel they have no choice, activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning and decision-making, drops dramatically. In other words, the belief that you're powerless literally shuts down the part of your brain that could free you. The narcissist thrives on this. Every time they convince you that resistance is useless, they're not just breaking your spirit, they're impairing your brain's ability to see alternatives. The illusion becomes self-fulfilling. And yet, history shows us that illusions can be shattered. Marcus Aurelius faced betrayal in his court, surrounded by men who whispered lies and manipulated truths. In his meditations, he reminded himself daily, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He knew that control is not external, it's internal. The narcissist may twist your perception, but they cannot touch the core of your judgment unless you hand it to them. So, the real danger isn't that they control you. The danger is that you believe they do. The illusion feels real because it plays on ancient vulnerabilities. Our need for belonging, our fear of rejection, our desire to be understood. But once you recognize the pattern, the spell weakens. You start to see the strings behind the puppet show. And when you see the strings, you're no longer the puppet. The illusion of control is their masterpiece, but awareness is the knife that cuts the wires. What happens when an illusion finally cracks? When the spell begins to fade, you glimpse a truth that feels both liberating and terrifying. The narcissist's power was never absolute. It was always borrowed, from your attention, your belief, your fear. The Stoics knew this long before modern psychology put words to it. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself each morning, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Seneca said that a man who masters himself cannot be enslaved by another. Epictetus, born a slave, insisted that freedom is not given but claimed, through the refusal to surrender judgment. Now science is proving them right. Neuroscientists have discovered that our brains are not static. They are plastic, adaptable, constantly reshaping themselves in response to experience. This is neuroplasticity, the ability to rewire pathways of thought and emotion. When you've been caught in the cycle of narcissistic manipulation, your brain has been trained to expect pain, to anticipate rejection, to brace for criticism. But neuroplasticity means those circuits can be rewritten. Each act of awareness, each moment of stepping back, each reframing of the story weakens the narcissist's hold and strengthens your own autonomy. Consider this. In one study at UCLA, patients who practiced mindfulness meditation for just 8 weeks showed measurable changes in the density of gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making and emotional regulation. In other words, by learning to pause, observe, and redirect attention, people literally rebuilt their brains. The Stoics were teaching this 2,000 years ago. They called it prosoche, or attentive awareness. Marcus Aurelius described it as standing guard at the door of your mind, deciding which impressions to admit and which to reject. Today, we call it cognitive reframing. Different words, same principle. Reclaim the filter of your perception, and you reclaim your life. And yet, breaking the spell is not easy. The narcissist thrives on your automatic reactions, the hurt in your eyes, the defensiveness in your voice, the desperate attempt to explain yourself. Every reaction is food for their ego. Epictetus warned, if someone succeeds in provoking you, realize that your mind is complicit in the provocation. This isn't blame, it's power. Because once you see that your response is the key, you realize you can change the entire game. Modern therapies echo this. Dialectical behavioral therapy, for example, teaches emotional regulation by creating space between trigger and reaction. That space is your weapon. That space is freedom. Carl Jung would say that breaking the spell requires confronting the shadow. The narcissist casts a projection, and you must decide whether to accept it. Do you take their criticism as truth, or do you recognize it as a reflection of their wounds? Jung believed that when you integrate your shadow, when you accept the parts of yourself you once denied, you rob the narcissist of their strongest weapon. They can no longer shame you with your own unacknowledged flaws, because you have already claimed them. Think of Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived Nazi concentration camps. He wrote in Man's Search for Meaning that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. If Frankl could claim inner freedom in the face of unimaginable cruelty, then you can claim it in the face of a narcissist's manipulation. The Stoics would agree, and neuroscience confirms it. Attitude, perception, focus, these are not passive traits. They are active circuits in the brain, shaped by practice, strengthened by repetition. Here is the turning point. The narcissist's spell depends on your unconsciousness. They count on you reacting without thinking, believing without questioning, surrendering without noticing. The antidote is consciousness, slow, steady, deliberate. When you pause before replying, when you label a gaslighting attempt for what it is, when you remind yourself that your worth is not theirs to define, you are breaking the spell. And each break weakens their illusion until it collapses entirely. So the Stoics give us the wisdom, and neuroscience gives us the proof. Inner freedom is not a theory. It is a practice, a rewiring, a daily act of reclaiming. The narcissist wants to live rent-free in your mind. The Stoics and science together remind you that you own the keys. The spell is strong, yes, but it is not unbreakable. Revenge. The word itself burns like fire in the chest. When someone has humiliated you, drained you, broken your trust, the instinct to strike back feels primal, almost irresistible. Freud would say this is the ID demanding balance, the raw impulse to restore dignity through retaliation. Jung would describe it as the shadow-seeking expression, the darker self that refuses to stay hidden any longer. But the Stoics, and even modern psychology, warn us of a paradox. If you pursue revenge in its destructive form, you often end up chained to the very person you wanted to escape. The question is not whether you want revenge, but what kind of revenge will truly free you. Seneca wrote, "The best revenge is not to be like your enemy." To a wounded ego, this might sound unsatisfying, almost like surrender. But think carefully. What does a narcissist crave? Attention, emotional investment, proof that they still occupy your mind. If you lash out, scream, sabotage, or obsess, you are still giving them exactly what they want, energy. Neuroscience confirms this trap. Studies on rumination show that when you fixate on someone who wronged you, your stress hormones remain elevated for hours, sometimes days. Cortisol floods your system, impairing memory and weakening your immune response. In other words, destructive revenge doesn't free you. It enslaves you to a chemical loop of anger and stress. But there is another kind of revenge, one that both the ancients and modern thinkers understood. Marcus Aurelius said that living well is the greatest form of defiance. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming your true self despite the forces that tried to fragment you. Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, echoed this with his belief that self-actualization is the ultimate response to those who sought to diminish us. True revenge, then, is not about destruction but transformation. It is not about proving them wrong. It is about proving yourself right. Consider the statistics. Survivors of narcissistic abuse often experience post-traumatic growth, a phenomenon documented in clinical psychology where individuals emerge stronger, more resilient, and more authentic after deep suffering. One study published in Psychological Inquiry found that up to 70% of trauma survivors reported positive personal transformation, greater empathy, and a sharper sense of life purpose. That is not weakness. That is the ultimate revenge, turning the very wound they inflicted into a source of power they can no longer touch. And think of those who embodied this path. Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for 27 years, could have chosen vengeance upon release. Instead, he chose growth, reconciliation, and the building of a nation. His strength was not the denial of anger, but its transmutation into something untouchable by his oppressors. A narcissist, by contrast, is trapped in a cycle of shallow victories and deeper emptiness. By breaking free, by flourishing, you expose their fundamental weakness. They cannot create. They can only feed. But this path does not mean passivity. It means strategy. It means understanding that silence, distance, and success are sharper weapons than rage. Freud once remarked that the act of sublimation, transforming destructive impulses into creative expression, is the hallmark of maturity. Every time you channel your anger into building something new, every time you cultivate your talents instead of defending your wounds, you strike at the very root of their illusion of power. They expected your destruction. Your thriving is the revenge they never anticipated. Of course, the desire for visible justice remains. And here's the paradox again. The narcissist often destroys themselves without your help. Studies show that narcissistic traits, particularly grandiosity and lack of empathy, predict higher rates of failed relationships, job instability, and eventual isolation. In a longitudinal study, narcissists reported lower life satisfaction over time, despite early appearances of success. They sabotage themselves because their mask is unsustainable. Your role is not to push them off the cliff. It is simply to step aside while they walk toward it on their own. So the true face of revenge is not blood and fire. It is calm, silent strength. It is the kind of power that doesn't need to be announced, because it radiates in your very presence. The narcissist wanted you broken, small, reactive. Instead, you become grounded, expansive, unshakable. That is not surrender. That is victory. The Stoics called it virtue. Jung called it wholeness. Today, we might simply call it freedom. And freedom, in the end, is the only revenge worth taking. Carl Jung believed that the wound is the place where light enters us. What does that mean in the context of surviving a narcissist? It means that the very pain you endured, the confusion, the betrayal, the endless cycles of hope and disappointment, contains within it the seed of your transformation. Freud once observed that, out of your vulnerabilities will come your strength. Neuroscience, centuries later, agrees. Studies on resilience show that people who face and process trauma often emerge with greater clarity, deeper empathy, and an unshakable sense of self. The pain you thought would break you can, paradoxically, become the fire that forges your strength. But transcendence doesn't happen by accident. It begins with a shift in perspective. Epictetus taught that events themselves are neutral. It is our interpretation that gives them power. When you see the narcissist not as the source of your worth, but as the trigger for your awakening, you begin to rewrite the story. Suddenly, what once felt like punishment becomes initiation. What once seemed like chaos becomes training. Neuroscientists call this post-traumatic growth, and it has been measured in countless survivors. A 2019 study showed that people who consciously reframed their suffering reported higher levels of meaning in life, stronger relationships, and greater inner peace. This isn't theory, it's data. And yet, transcendence requires something even deeper: integration. Jung insisted that we must face our shadow, not deny it. The narcissist forces you to confront your shadow, the need for validation, the fear of rejection, the doubt about your worth. Instead of running from these wounds, you examine them. You hold them to the light, and once they are seen, they lose their power to control you. Freud called this process working through, the deliberate act of bringing unconscious pain into conscious awareness so that it no longer dictates your choices. In practical terms, it means noticing when you crave their approval, when you replay their criticisms, when you shrink in their presence. And instead of obeying those impulses, you sit with them, observe them, and choose differently. Think of Marcus Aurelius in his final years, surrounded by betrayal, plague, and war. In his meditations, he returned again and again to one truth. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The narcissist was the impediment. But in transcending them, the pain itself becomes the path. Your strength is not found despite them. It is forged because of them. Modern neuroscience explains why. Every time you face a trigger and choose a new response, your brain creates fresh neural pathways. This is not metaphor, it is biology. Dr. Richard Davidson, a leading researcher in effective neuroscience, demonstrated that compassion training and mindfulness literally reshape the circuits of the brain, enhancing resilience and emotional regulation. When you refuse to play the narcissist's game, when you redirect your energy toward growth, you are rewiring yourself for strength. Each act of transcendence is a physical reprogramming of your nervous system. And let's not forget the paradox that terrifies every narcissist: they cannot transcend. They remain locked in their own cycle, endlessly chasing admiration, endlessly fleeing from emptiness. You, on the other hand, can turn pain into wisdom, humiliation into dignity, betrayal into clarity. That is the difference. That is your victory. But transcendence is not just survival. It is expansion. It is realizing that the narcissist no longer defines the boundaries of your life. It is building relationships rooted in authenticity, creativity, and empathy. It is pursuing goals not to prove your worth, but to express it. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming whole, unique, unshaken by external masks. The narcissist wanted you fragmented, doubting, reactive. Transcendence makes you complete, calm, unstoppable. So ask yourself, what if the pain was never meant to destroy you? What if it was meant to reveal you? Every sleepless night, every unanswered question, every tear shed was not wasted, it was investment. Investment in your awakening, in your resilience, in the unshakable core you now carry. The narcissist may have been the storm, but you are the mountain that endures it. And mountains do not bow to storms. Transcendence is not forgetting, and it is not revenge. It is elevation. It is the moment you step beyond their reach, not because they changed, but because you did. Pain into strength, shadow into wisdom, chaos into power. That is how you transcend the narcissist. Carl Jung ons rot, jij hem not wat append to me, jij hem wat die chose to become. That line is the essence of the final victory over a narcissist. Because the truth is this, freedom is not when they stop hurting you, freedom is when they can no longer reach you. And that shift doesn't happen when they change, it happens when you do. Let's begin with a striking fact. Studies show that people who fully detach from toxic relationships often experience measurable improvement in health. A landmark study at Ohio State University revealed that individuals who ended long-term emotionally abusive relationships saw lower blood pressure, reduced cortisol level, and improved immune system function within just 1 year. Think about that. Walking away from a narcissist doesn't just free your mind, it literally your body. This is victory written into your very biology. But freedom is not simply absence, it is presence. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by betrayal and shaming senator, reminded himself, the best way to avenge yourself is not to become like the wrongdoer. Final victory is not proving them wrong. It's living so fully that their shadow no longer touch you. It is rediscovering joy in the small things, purpose in your work, dignity in your choice. The narcissist thrive on knowing you are still thinking of them. Real victory is when you no longer are. Freud believed that unresolved trauma repeats itself until it is transformed. Jung added that when we refuse to integrate the lesson of suffering, they return à FATE. But once you see the pattern, once you cleanse the meaning, the sick lens. Freedom beyond their reach means they cannot drag you into repetition anymore. They cannot pull your string. They cannot provoke your anger just to test your energy. You have cut the invisible core. And here's the paradox, when you stop fighting for their validation, you no longer need revenge at all. Your growth is the revenge. Your peace is the counterattack. Your thriving life is the wound they cannot heal. Neuroscience back this up. Brain imaging studies show that gratitude, focus on purpose, and self-compassion activate the brain's reward circuitry far more strongly than ruminating on anger. In other words, choosing freedom doesn't just feel better, it literally rewires you for long-term resilience. Let's ground this in history. Epictetus, who lived as a slave, endured cruelty daily. Yet he insisted that no man could truly harm him unless he surrendered his will. His final victory was not escape, but mastery of himself. Viktor Frankl showed the same truth from a concentration camp. The last freedom, the one no tyrant can take, is the freedom to choose your attitude. The narcissist might steal your time, your peace, even part of your story. But they cannot touch your response unless you allow it. That is the unbreakable fortress. And once you claim this freedom, something remarkable happens, you become untouchable. The narcissist may try again, with new insult, new game, new manipulation. But they find nothing to hook into, because the part of you that craved their approval is gone. The shadow has been faced. The wound has been healed. You stand in wholeness, and they cannot enter. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the state where you are no longer fragmented by outside force, but all within yourself. The final victory is not loud. It doesn't demand applause. It doesn't need to be posted or proven. It is quiet, steady, radiant. It's in the way you wake up without anxiety, the way you walk into a room without shrinking, the way you speak without waiting for permission. It's in the way you live fully, deeply, without them in your orbit. The narcissist become what they always were, small, temporary, irrelevant. So here is the truth. Revenge was the spark, transcendence was the fire, but freedom is the sunrise. And once it rises, there is no shadow strong enough to darken it again. The narcissist's reach ends where your awareness begins. And in that awareness, you are not just free, you are victorious.